There are truths that no one dares to face, and Machiavelli would be the first to point them out without shame. One of them is this: loneliness is not born of chance, nor of a timid personality, but of something much deeper. The loneliness that many carry is not weakness, it is a consequence. And before you try to explain it with ready-made phrases or quick diagnoses, ask a question that almost no one dares to ask. When exactly does someone learn that the world is not a safe place to feel? Machiavelli said that men only see the surface. Therefore, they don't realize that loneliness begins long before adulthood, in moments so subtle that they go unnoticed, even by those who caused them. A child seeks comfort, but finds haste, seeks understanding, but receives indifference. And in this silent clash between need and absence, the first fissure is born, the one that no one talks about because no one wants to admit it. Like a prince surrounded by blind advisors, the child learns early on that exposing what they feel is offering the world something that may be ignored or despised. But what does this learning conceal? What does it awaken? And why do some carry this trait throughout their lives while others abandon it? Machiavelli would suggest observing with cold eyes, because there, in silent childhood, the first loss of trust in others occurs. There is no explicit drama, no shouting, no rupture, only a void too small to be noticed and large enough to change everything. And so, the seed of loneliness takes root, discreetly, uncomfortably, and inevitably. The next part reveals how this seed transforms into a pattern, and why the world rarely notices it until it's too late. There's a specific moment when everything starts to distort, and it's so common that almost no one notices. Imagine a child returning from school with a strange weight on their chest. Perhaps someone made a cruel joke. Perhaps the teacher was too harsh. Perhaps they simply felt something they can't name. They enter the house seeking a gaze to hold them, a phrase to organize their inner self. But they find what so many people find every day: a tired, distracted adult, immersed in their own chaos. The response comes quickly, almost automatically. "We'll talk later." Or worse, no response at all. Just the sound of clinking cutlery, notifications vibrating on the cell phone, a television on in the background. The child stands there still, holding what they feel with both hands because no one else seems willing to hold it. Machiavelli would say that this is the kind of moment that defines the formation of an individual much more than any major event, because it silently teaches that the world is unpredictable and that depending on others is risky. Over time, this scene repeats itself in different versions. The child proudly shows a drawing they made and receives only a dismissive "cool." They try to explain why they're upset, but are met only with the word tantrum. They seek comfort and find haste. And Machiavelli would observe this pattern with strategic coldness, pointing out what no one wants to admit. Emotional neglect doesn't scream, but it leaves deep scars. It creates a kind of internal estrangement, as if the child begins to doubt their own need to be seen. And then something unexpected happens. The child begins to anticipate disinterest. Even before speaking, she imagines the empty response, the distant gaze, the abrupt interruption. She begins to keep her eye feelings to herself, not by choice, but for survival. And it is at this point that the mystery sets in. A being so young, who should instinctively trust the world, begins to act like someone who has already learned too much about it. She becomes vigilant, cautious, discreet, a little emotional strategist. Machiavelli would see in this the first real movement of self-defense, the first internal reorganization that prepares the ground for the solitary figure who will emerge later. The next part reveals how this repeated learning transforms into a definitive pattern, capable of altering the entire way this child, and later this adult, will relate to the world. The repetition of these small silences creates something that no one sees happening, but that transforms everything from within. The child begins to build an inner world where she herself is the only reliable presence. It is not a conscious gesture, nor a protest. It is an almost biological movement, as if the body and mind decided together that depending on others is no longer safe. Machiavelli would observe this transition with precision because he knew that every human being, when repeatedly wounded, learns to conserve vulnerability as one protects a scarce resource. Over time, this child begins to act differently, more discreetly, more restrained, more carefully. They realize that their emotions seem to cause discomfort, and that their joy, doubts, or fears find no space to exist outside of themselves. So they withdraw. They learn to regulate their own crying, to swallow questions, to transform frustration into silence. The first sign of a future loneliness emerges there. Someone who realized, too early, that the world has no obligation to embrace what they feel. And here an inevitable question arises. When does silence become more comfortable than the risk of not being heard? This pattern deepens silently, like a shadow that lengthens as the day ends. The child begins to anticipate reactions, cuts, sentences short, gives up before even trying, and the more they adapt, the more this behavior crystallizes into their identity. Loneliness ceases to be absence and becomes familiar territory. But what really changes when someone stops expecting something from others? Perhaps that's the secret turning point. It's not that they've given up on the world, it's that they've discovered it's less painful to exist for themselves than to insist on being seen by those who don't know how to see. The suspense of this transition lies in the fact that no one around notices. The child smiles, participates, talks when necessary, but something essential has been placed behind a door that only she knows where it is. And Machiavelli would say that this is exactly how the individual capable of enduring more than they appear to be is born, not through explicit hardening, but through the silent reorganization of their own heart. And here is another question that nudges from within. What happens when this strategy ceases to be protection and becomes a permanent way of living? The next part reveals this transformation. Over the years, the child who has learned to silence their own inner world develops an unexpected skill. They begin to see details that others completely ignore. It's as if the mind, deprived of emotional responses, has sharpened other senses to compensate. Instead of seeking comfort, they observe. Instead of trusting, they interpret. And without realizing it, they become the kind of person who senses the change in atmosphere in a room even before anyone speaks. This phenomenon is not uncommon. Studies show that children exposed to emotional unpredictability develop a kind of social hypervigilance, a fine reading of expressions, posture, and intention, often more accurate than that of trained adults. Machiavelli would see this not as a trauma, but as a strategic advantage formed unintentionally. It's common to find accounts of people who, even at a young age, could predict arguments before they started, perceive hidden falsehoods in compliments, and detect lies without much evidence. One person recounted being able to identify her mother's mood simply by the sound of her keys being left on the table. Another knew when her father was about to explode just by the way he breathed when he entered the house. Small, almost invisible signs, but for them, they meant the difference between peace and chaos. The surprising thing is that in many cases, this ability continues into adulthood, making them accurate observers, even if that was never their intention. This raises a disturbing question. What happens when a child unintentionally develops the kind of perception that many leaders and strategists spend decades trying to acquire? This heightened sensitivity, however, comes at a price. The more a person observes, the less they participate. They withdraw, not out of contempt, but out of anticipation. They sense the conflict before the conflict, the disappointment before the deception, the falsehood before the mask falls. And this precocious awareness creates an internal space that is difficult to explain, an emotional distance that seems to increase each time they understand something that others do not see. Machiavelli would say that understanding men too much can alienate those who still simply wish to experience them. A silent question then arises. To what extent does this ability to read the world protect, and at what point does it begin to isolate? Gradually, this person becomes someone who lives between two planes. The visible one, where everyone moves without thinking, and the invisible one, where she analyzes everything like an attentive strategist. And the most impressive thing is that, while the world sees her as calm, reserved, and even introspective, inside she functions as a constant sentinel, assessing risks and anticipating outcomes. None of this is sought. It is merely the inevitable consequence of having grown up in the unstable terrain of others' emotions. And so, without fanfare, without dramatic rupture, she becomes the figure who observes from afar, who perceives beforehand, who feels more than she shows. The question that remains is simple and disturbing. What will this ability, now fully formed, provoke in the way she relates to the world from now on? The next part reveals this transformation. Over time, This silent observation ceases to be merely a defense mechanism and transforms into something deeper, a form of control. The person realizes that the less they reveal, the less others can touch, distort, or use against them. And it is precisely here that the turning point that changes everything occurs. One day, perhaps during a casual conversation, they decide to open their heart a little more. They say something sincere, something rare, something they have kept for years. But the reaction is not care or understanding. It is indifference, or judgment, or in some cases, a joke, made at the worst possible moment. This instant, so simple for an outsider, marks an invisible line that will hardly be crossed again. From then on, they understand that certain parts of themselves need to remain inaccessible forever. The most troubling aspect is that sometimes this vulnerability is later used as a weapon, a confession transformed into criticism, a fear converted into an attack, an intimate memory thrown onto the table during an argument. This type of emotional blow doesn't leave bruises, but it changes a person's internal architecture. Machiavelli would say that no one forgets when they are betrayed by what is most human in them. From that point on, openness ceases to be an option. The armor closes definitively, not out of coldness but out of painful wisdom. And then a behavior emerges that few understand. The person remains present, continues conversing, continues socializing, but without allowing anyone to cross certain internal boundaries. They know exactly how far they can go and how far others can enter. It's a rigorous, almost strategic emotional management, and this raises an inevitable question. What remains when no one else has access to what is real inside you? This is the moment when solitude ceases to be merely protection and becomes identity. It's not forced isolation, it's a choice shaped by years of small setbacks, small rejections, and long silences. The mystery is that, on the outside, everything seems normal. Inside, the person has already decided that trust is too costly, and this prepares the ground for the final stage of this transformation, where solitude is not loss, but power. The conclusion will reveal what this path truly creates. Upon arriving here, it becomes clear that the solitary person is not someone broken, but someone who learned too early to protect themselves. The real turning point happens when they understand that this defense, previously instinctive, can transform into conscious strength. It is at this point that everything changes. When you decide that solitude doesn't have to be a wall, it can be a foundation. It can be the place where you rebuild your autonomy, your choices, and your peace. Machiavelli would say that power begins when you govern yourself. And this means learning to select who enters, who stays, and who doesn't deserve any access at all. The practical application is simple, yet profound. Observe your patterns, recognize where they came from, and calmly choose what still makes sense to keep. Allow yourself to open small cracks only for those who demonstrate real consistency, not empty promises. And above all, treat your own company as something valuable, not as a last resort. If this content spoke to you on any level, leave a like, comment, even anonymously, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-knowledge and inner strength.